As I mentioned during the announcements, I will be giving two sermons this morning. First, I want to look briefly at Christ the King, because we are celebrating Christ the King Sunday. It might seem a little strange that for this Sunday we read a lesson from the crucifixion of Jesus. And how can Jesus be king hanging on the cross? So I want to just briefly look at this. The first thing I want you to notice is that there are three different groups that encourage Jesus to save himself. First, we have the leaders who scoff and say to save himself. Then we have the soldiers who scoff him, call him a king, and then tell him to save himself. Excuse me. And then we have one of the criminals, who again is deriding him and saying to save himself and also the criminals. As I look at this, I believe it ties into the story at the beginning of Luke's Gospel where Jesus is tempted in the wilderness. Tempted not to be the Son of God, to give in to Satan's temptation. And here again, Satan has come back and 3 times using people to try and tempt Jesus not to go through with what God has planned for him. And so I think first of all, by Jesus refusing to give in to the temptation to save himself, shows that he has power over Satan. Second, as we look at Jesus' first word of the cross to those who crucified him, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do, shows Jesus' power, Jesus' authority over sin. The ability to forgive sins, and that's why he's hanging on the cross. Finally, we look at Jesus' last word to the thief on the cross. Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise. Shows Jesus' power to rule on high, to determine who is going to spend eternity with him, but also shows Jesus' power over death. And so in this brief passage, we have here a passage that reminds us of Jesus' power and authority. His power and authority over sin, his power and authority over Satan, and his power and authority over death. And that's the reason we gather at the end of the church year to celebrate Jesus as Christ the King. All right, that's sermon number 1. Now, sermon number 2. This one will be a little longer. Today is Women's Thank Offering Sunday, and I wanted to do something for Thank Offering Sunday other than looking at Christ the King. And I remembered that passage that Jesus gave the Great Commission before he ascended into heaven. Jesus reminded us to go, therefore, and make disciples of all nations. As we look at the book of Acts, we hear of people such as Peter and Paul, Priscilla and her husband Aquila, traveling throughout Europe and Asia, spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. But there are other people that I believe in their own way also help to spread the gospel of Jesus Christ through their acts of love. And I'd like to read a little bit about Dorcas or Tabitha from Acts chapter 9. We read, in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha. Notice she's called a disciple, even though she didn't travel around as Paul or Peter or Priscilla did. In Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha, which when translated is Dorcas, who was always doing good and helping the poor. About that time she became sick and died, and her body was washed and placed in an upstairs room. Lydia was near Joppa, so when the disciples heard that Peter was in Lydia, they sent 2 men to him and urged him, please come at once. Peter went with them, and when he arrived, he was taken upstairs to the room. And again, listen to this. All of the widows stood around him, crying and showing him the robes and other clothing that Dorcas had made while she was still with them. And of course, we all know that Peter then brought her back to life. This morning, on this day when we remember thank offering, I'd like to share with you 2 women that I believe are examples of missionaries. Neither one of them traveled to Japan or Papua New Guinea, or Cameroon. They lived in their own community, and yet in their own unique ways helped to spread the gospel. And I believe they are examples of what the women's organizations have been doing for over 100 years. For the women's organizations have been the arm of the church that has encouraged the church to go and make disciples. They have been the arm of the church that has encouraged congregations, encouraged the churches to be concerned about mission. Even at times when there was little or no money, the women continued to uphold that concern for the mission of the church. And that is why I want to pay tribute to some women who I believe in their own way were like Dorcas or Tabitha in serving the Lord as being missionaries to the world. The first person who I want to talk about extensively is my mother. You probably noticed in the bulletin that she turns 97 tomorrow. We celebrated her birthday yesterday afternoon at the nursing home. And she is the primary reason that I have always been interested in the mission work of the church, of spreading the gospel through word and deed. For that was my mom's major concern, was to help those who were in need throughout the world. I always remember her receiving her little thank offering box in December. They would always have my home church had their thank offering service at their November meeting, and then in December they would get their new box. And I remember how that little box always sat on the dresser in my parents' bedroom. And throughout the year, my mom would continually put coins in there. So by the time the following November rolled around, her little box was full of coins. And as a little boy, I always marveled at how heavy that was. And I wonder how many coins, how much money there is in that little box. And yet, for her, that was great joy because it was money out of her own. Not a check that Dad would write, but it was her own money that she was able to bring to the women's meeting. And that money would go to help spread the gospel and help the women continue to do the work of the Lord. One of the things that my mom always enjoyed doing was working on Lutheran World Relief projects. I remember she always, every year, would make 2, 3, 4 sewing kits. And I remember going with her to the fabric shop in Mitchell, the one right by the viaduct, and she would spend her time picking out some nice, colorful yarn to include in that sewing kit, and then would make those up and take them to the women's meeting. But I also remember her being involved in the school kits. Now, I don't ever remember her going and purchasing pencils and paper and so on for them, but she would be the woman in the church that would make the book bags. There was a pattern, she followed that pattern still on the Lutheran World Relief site. And so she would get the material and she would make these book bags. And I think she made hundreds of them. Whenever somebody would have a drive to assemble some bags, school kits for Lutheran World Relief, whether it was the women's group or the Bible study group or the junior league or the Sunday school or the senior league, they would always ask Mom, we need so many bags, and she would gladly make them and bring them to church. But her real joy was making quilts. She made quilts for all of her grandchildren as wedding presents. We still have Joel, maybe one of these days, years or centuries, he'll get married, who knows, and he can have his quilt. Mom gave it to us and said, this is for Joel whenever he gets married. All of the grandchildren got quilts, and these were hand-stitched, pieced quilts, beautiful works of art. She enjoyed doing that. She also made smaller quilts for all of the great-grandchildren, usually given at their baptism until she wasn't able to do that anymore. But her real joy was making Lutheran World Relief quilts. She would, St. John's, my home church, would always make quilts one day a month, and they'd be there all day. And I remember that because that was the day my dad would have to cook for us, and that's how we got to do that. He wasn't a bad cook, that's where I because if we wanted to eat, he'd have to cook, because Mom was our church, and she wasn't going to come home to feed us. She was making quilts. After they retired from the farm and moved to Mitchell, she continued to go to Trinity Lutheran, and they had quilt making, and they still do every Tuesday morning from like 9 or 8:30 to 12. And she would faithfully go, even when she was in her 90s, she would still go, even though she couldn't see very well, she'd be there cutting out quilt blocks. But she also spent hours and hours and hours at home sewing quilts and getting them ready, whether they're cutting blocks out, tearing apart fabric, material, and getting them ready so that when they got to church, the women who couldn't sew could tie the quilts together. I mentioned some time ago about how she was in charge of the projects when I was at seminary, and every time I came home to visit, she would make sure my car was loaded up with quilts and kits and other supplies so I could take them to Minneapolis. Lutheran World Relief has two warehouses. One is in Minneapolis and the other is in Maryland. And I would have to take those to the warehouse so they could save on shipping costs, could use that money to buy more material and other things they needed. But I think the most interesting thing that she did was to make soap. Lutheran World Relief has always asked for soap. And I remember this coffee can, that was when coffee came in cans, not plastic containers, sitting on our stove, and whenever Mom would fry some meat and there'd be some grease, she'd dump it in the can. When that can get full, it'd go down in the basement, another can would come to be put on the stove. And then when we worked in the fall of the year, all of the extra lard would be rendered out, and so she'd have more grease, and then she'd go to town and buy her can after can after can of lard, and then came the time to make the soap. She would get out her supplies because she used it only for making soap, and she would make a batch, 3, 4, 5 batches, depending on how much lard she had of soap. And then came the process of cutting it. Of course, some of the soap would be saved because she was convinced that that was the only soap that could get my dad's greasy coveralls clean. So she had to save some for cleaning Dad's coveralls. And the rest was wrapped up, boxed up, and sent to Lutheran World Relief. Mom, in her own way, was a missionary. No, she didn't travel to a foreign country, but she was concerned about sharing Christ's love. And the vehicle that she used was the work of Lutheran World Relief, and it brought her great joy. I would also share one other woman who I believe was a missionary, a woman that most of you know, and that was Adeline Young. Adeline Young, when she died, we discovered that she had tithed her estate. And so Trinity got 5% of the estate, and Lutheran World Relief got the other 5%. It amounted to a gift between $1,100 and $1,200, I believe. And this last church council meeting, we as a church council had the great pleasure of giving away $4,000 that gift had accumulated over the last few years since the stock market has gone up. So we gave the money to the Native American Mission Congregation in Rapid City, the Hispanic congregation at Augustana Lutheran in Sioux Falls, gift to St. Dismas at Springfield, and a gift to St. Dismas at Penitentiary. We gave a nice sizable donation to Lutheran Outdoors. We set aside money for campers next year to go to camp from Trinity, and we also gave a donation to the Chamberlain Area Ministerial. And here again, Adeline, who was so concerned about her church and a mission to the church, even though she has been deceased for going on probably 8 years, is still accomplishing great mission work through the state that she left to the church, to Lutheran World Relief. Today, as we celebrate women and remember their ingathering of thank offering, is a chance to again thank women for their work in the church and for their upholding of the mission and the importance of spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. One last thing I wanted to mention was in the bulletin, there is a little note about Lutheran World Relief. And I think all of us have heard about the terrible Category 5 typhoon that hit the Philippines 3 weeks ago, a month ago. Lutheran World Relief has responded very generously, providing different types of kits, including personal care kits, baby care kits, school kits, and quilts, as well as other things, enough to help 26,000 people. But the problem is that the magnitude of that disaster has literally emptied their warehouses. And so they have sent out a special appeal to help in whatever way people in the church can help out. so that they might continue to respond to different needs wherever or disasters rather, wherever they occur throughout the world. Again, on this Thank Offering Sunday, I want to say thank you, women. Thank you for upholding the important mission of the church through your generous donations and through your projects that you do for Lutheran World Relief. I know many times it goes unheeded, but it's greatly appreciated, not only by me, but the people you help throughout the world.